40 meters deep, researchers found a single, perfectly straight stone column featuring 3 man-made holes and no local origin. It was abandoned 10,000 years ago during a flood that redrew the map of Europe. This discovery remained in the shadows of the archaeological record for years. It was dismissed by many as a scale misunderstanding. Mainstream history prefers to see the early Mesolithic as a time of simple tools and small tribes. A solitary 15-ton anomaly that exists 10 millennia before it should is an uncomfortable truth for any established timeline. Because it did not fit the template of a sprawling city, it was left beneath the waves. For a long time, it was classified as a geological freak of nature until the stone itself began to speak. Before the silence, this was a world of islands and interconnected ridges. The people here were not just survivors. They were engineers of a nameless society. On a high plateau now known as the Pantelleria Vecchia Bank, they were engaged in a project of staggering ambition. They were quarrying a single 12-meter slab of limestone from a source hundreds of meters away. They were moving a weight that would crush a modern vehicle through terrain that offered no mercy. We have long believed that such coordination required the invention of agriculture to feed the workers. But these people were doing it 5,000 years before the first farm was ever tilled. They were building something meant to last forever on land they thought was eternal. But nature does not drill 3 perfectly circular equidistant channels through 15 tons of solid limestone. The end of this world was a slow-motion catastrophe. For generations, the inhabitants of the archipelago watched as the horizon crept closer. The polar ice caps were melting, surging into the Mediterranean basin and turning their hunting grounds into salt marshes. This was not a sudden wave, but a relentless, rising tide. Imagine the psychological toll of laboring on a monument while the ocean is visibly reclaiming your land. Every year, the beach moved inland. Every decade, a landmark vanished. The air grew thick with the smell of brine and rotting seagrass as the freshwater springs were poisoned by the salt. As the waters rose, the ground became a saturated, treacherous bog. The limestone ridge that connected the islands began to narrow, and the path to the monument's destination was swallowed by the surf. The workers likely spent their final days in a state of mounting desperation, trying to finish a project that the planet was actively vetoing. They weren't just fighting the weight of the stone, they were fighting the clock of a changing world. When the core samples were analyzed, the results placed the carving of this stone in the early Mesolithic, nearly 5,000 years before the first stone was laid at Stonehenge. Finally, the sea reached the edge of the quarry. The mud became too deep to move 15 tons of rock, and the islands became too small to support the people. There is a specific dread in this moment, the point where the last rope was cut and the last architect looked back at their greatest achievement. They didn't leave because they were finished. They left because the geography of their world was being erased in real time. The water rose faster than they could build, turning their masterpiece into a tombstone for an entire culture before it could even be named. They retreated to the high ground of Sicily and Tunisia, leaving their history to drown in the dark. For 10,000 years, the stone sat in total darkness, a solitary witness to the world that was lost. We spent centuries looking for Atlantis in poetry and myth, while the real evidence of our first great struggle against the rising tide was simply waiting 40 meters down, in a stone that refused to dissolve. Moving a 12-meter pillar of this density across the rugged Sicilian archipelago required a logistics chain and a permanent workforce that, according to every history book, simply did not exist yet. The physical record presents a mystery that no institutional record can bridge. The standard archaeological history of the Mediterranean describes the Mesolithic Sicilians as nomadic foragers living in caves. Yet, the 2015 report by researchers Lodolo and Galata documents a 15-ton limestone block that had been quarried, cut, and moved with a precision that requires a specialized, permanent social hierarchy. This is the contradiction that sits at the bottom of the Sicilian Channel. It is a physical object that proves a level of sophistication the written record says was impossible. Today, the site is a silent field of geometric stone blocks, broken and half buried in the silt. It proves only that our ancestors were more capable than our history books allow. The monolith wasn't found in a city. It was found alone on a submerged ridge, suggesting it was abandoned in mid-transport as the sea levels rose faster than the workers could run. Scholars who champion the ritual center theory look at the monolith and see the birth of religion. They point to the three holes as mounting points for totems or ritual symbols. They argue that the stone was a central beacon for a culture that gathered here from across the archipelago. This perspective holds that shared belief was the only force strong enough to organize hundreds of nomads into a labor force. It is a powerful image of human unity. But this theory falters against the silence of the seabed. If this was a sacred center, why is it the only monument of its kind for hundreds of miles? Conversely, maritime historians propose a more practical origin. They see the three drilled holes not as ritual sockets, but as mechanical anchor points for a sophisticated mooring system. In this view, the monolith was the infrastructure of a maritime empire that thrived on the bounty of the Sicilian Channel. It was a functional tool of survival. Yet, this theory leaves its own gap. Why spend years carving 15 tons of rock when a smaller, manageable anchor would have sufficed? The scale of the effort seems to outweigh the practical need. Despite years of sonar mapping, the Sicilian monolith remains a solitary ghost, a single massive sentence from a book where every other page has been dissolved by the sea. One disputed version holds that the monolith is merely the last surviving fragment of a much larger, complex Ice Age society that was completely erased by the rising waters. Advocates of this theory believe that beneath the thick sediment of the Mediterranean floor lie entire cities that were built on coastal plains now lost to the deep. If this is true, the monolith isn't an early masterpiece. It is a final, desperate gasp of a dying civilization. The record is silent because the evidence is buried under millions of tons of salt and mud, unreachable by our current technology. We are looking at the tip of an iceberg that has been melting for 10,000 years. The stone remains exactly where it fell, a 12-meter shadow in a world of absolute silence. The tides that once forced its abandonment now act as its only guardian. The three holes, carved with such clear intent 10,000 years ago, are now home to deep-sea silt and darkness. This stone is a bridge to a mind we can never truly know, a physical proof of effort and intellect that predates the very idea of history. It serves as a reminder that the world is a much older and more crowded place than our records suggest. Some stories do not end with a period, but with the rising water. That question of how those three perfect holes were drilled 10,000 years ago is now yours too. The record stops here. If the people who moved this 15-ton stone could see us today, a world once again watching the sea levels rise, what do you think they would warn us about the things we believe are permanent? The specific chemical composition of the boring tools used to create those three holes remains one of the most significant gaps in the historical record. No stone or metal fragments have ever been recovered from the site. Beyond discoveries exists for the gaps the mainstream historical record sealed over. Our next investigation moves to a wreck with a known last position log that no one has ever matched to a seabed site. An expedition that vanished while carrying a cargo that should not have existed. If you left this video with more questions than you arrived with, that is the correct response. There is more evidence. Subscribe and it will find you.